Welcome to Lighten Up, a show about bringing more love, light, and joy into your life, and archived on the Lighten Up program page. Please join us in the chat room by clicking on the chat room icon located on the left-hand side of our menu bar. Now the host of Lighten Up, Isabel Mirians.
Welcome to Lighten Up with Isabel, your good news show. I'm so delighted that you're with us today, and I want to thank all of my viewers from here and around the world for their continued viewership. We're doing something today quite unusual, and that is we're having a second program dealing with a subject that we've dealt with before. And the reason is because I feel very passionate about the fact that the subject matter is so vital. And that is, we're going to discuss something that has an effect on every living thing on earth, and therefore it's worth a second program. I feel that it's important for people to realize that for hundreds of years before current time, our earth was considered our mother and was considered sacred by everyone. Mother Earth, or Gaia, provided for all of our needs, our food, our building materials, and the people, all indigenous people, still see the earth as being sacred. Unfortunately, our time today, we have seen man mistreating Mother Earth and not taking care of her as we should have been doing. And so therefore, we're paying the price with daily blasts. As a matter of fact, just yesterday, Texas had a series of tornadoes, but we're seeing daily blasts of hurricanes, tsunamis, fires, droughts, and other very, very disturbing things. So my first bit of good news today is that my wonderful guest, Susan Golden, agreed to join us today for this second program on the environment. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you, Isabel. Hello, and thank you for having me again.
Well, it's my great pleasure. It's my very great pleasure. I know that you're a teacher, and I want to understand, and I'd like you to share with the viewers how you came to specialize in environmental studies.
Well, I was a high school science and math teacher, and when I began teaching environmental science, I realized that so many people know so little about the world we live in. So that's when it became my passion to go out and teach it. Currently, I'm on the board of the Hackensack Riverkeeper also, and they're a group that wants to make the Hackensack River swimmable and fishable, and they do it through advocacy and education and enforcement of environmental laws. So they do a lot of good, and I really honored to be part of them.
Well, that's wonderful. Now, I understand there is an alliance of river keepers.
Yes, it's called the Waterkeeper Alliance, and that's an international organization. And as a matter of fact, the Hackensack Riverkeeper is one of the founding members.
Oh, really?
That's run by Bobby Kennedy Jr., or was founded by Bobby Kennedy Jr., and the Hackensack Riverkeeper was one of the founding members.
Oh, that's wonderful. Now, I know that you also took a class with Al Gore, training course. Would you like to tell a little bit about that?
Well, Al Gore, since he's retired from politics, he has focused on climate change, and he has a nonprofit group called Climate Reality Project, and I'm a member of that leadership corps, and I was trained to give his presentation, this one that you saw in An Inconvenient Truth, as well as the sequel. And so I'm also licensed and trained to give that presentation as well.
That's impressive. No, I remember you telling me that. And I also remember telling me about when you were in 7th grade, what probably got you started on this track.
The Clearwater, being on the sloop, that was 5th grade. But yes, we went out on the Clearwater, which is a
sloop.
old sloop that's been restored, and we went and did water testing on the Hudson River.
Cool.
That's right.
Now, as I said before, good news is really hard to find, but I did manage to find some. So I'd like to share these things, and if you'd like to comment about any of them, please do. The first thing is that the ozone layer which, as we know, absorbs most of the sun's ultraviolet radiation and therefore protects the Earth, is healing itself. Would you explain to the audience how that came about?
Sure. The hole in the ozone layer happened because society was using a group of chemicals called chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs for short. We were using them in aerosols and refrigerants. And we found out that caused the ozone layer to break down, which was not good. And in 1992, the world got together and signed the Montreal Protocol, and they agreed to ban the use of these CFCs. And since then, slowly but surely, the ozone layer is healing itself.
Yeah, thank heavens. Well, that really shows that if the whole world unites, we can make a difference.
Right.
And that's a perfect example of that.
It is.
And that's what we need to do with this whole business of reversing climate change.
Yes, and that's what the Paris Accord was all about in 2015, and hopefully it's going to keep moving forward.
And the United Nations has a very strong position about it.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so my next bit of good news is that the Marriott, which is the world's largest hotel chain, is phasing out the use of single shampoo, conditioner, soap, and shower gel containers, and that will save 1.5 million pounds of plastic from landfills. So I thought that was wonderful because you're beginning to see action being taken by corporations as well as states, and of course California is really leading the way with that.
Yes.
Which is wonderful. Okay, the next bit of good news. Many countries around the world are committed to planting millions and millions of trees. Do you want to address that issue?
Well, just quickly, they're planting trees in an effort to help
reforestation
as well as creating a sink for the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. The plants will absorb it.
Yeah,
and there are quite a few countries, and they range from Canada and England and Ireland and Nepal and India and Ethiopia, as well as Madagascar, have all committed to plant government policies to plant between millions or billions of trees in the next few decades.
Which is that's really good news. Now, America, unfortunately, is not on that bandwagon.
Well, the government does not have a governmental policy, the federal government, but that doesn't mean that there are organizations throughout the country that do promote reforestation.
Yeah. Well, I know my granddaughter, who works for National Geographic, told me that a group of her co-workers and she went out and planted trees the other day.
That's lovely.
So, I know that there are many small groups that are doing this. And as a matter of fact, I think one of the nicest things that I found recently, I was recently invited to this lovely dinner party for a gentleman who had turned 100. And he's quite a remarkable person. And I thought to myself, what in the world do you give a 100-year-old man who's still very bright, very articulate, and has everything? So I thought, well, I'll plant some trees in his honor. So that's what I did. And I'm using that now more and more whenever I'm invited to something, because I can't go out shopping for gifts. And, and what do you give a 100-year-old man?
Well, that's a lovely, lovely gift. Great idea.
So I've been doing that recently. Okay, the last bit of good news that I have is that Australian scientists have discovered that there is a form of seaweed which is pink. And this pink seaweed, if it's mixed in with cattle feed, reduces the methane which cows produce by over 90%, which is pretty remarkable.
That is.
And because I know that cattle are big, producers of that.
They are.
So
industrial agriculture is responsible for a large amount of anthropogenic sourced methane.
Absolutely. And I'm sure the pastures also smell a lot nicer. You have to work in them. Well, I think one of the most important things that we have to recognize is that if all the nations around the world work together, as with, we spoke up earlier, we can reverse global warming. I want to just tell you that about 20 years ago, one day my husband made this statement to me. He said, "Someday you'll see that a gallon of clean water will be as valuable as a gallon of gasoline." And I looked at him and I said, "What are you saying?" He said, "You'll see it. It'll come to pass." And of course, clean water is becoming a more and more valuable resource. And I know that that's one of your focuses is clean water. So and I do know that there's so many millions of people who have to walk many miles each day just to find clean water.
Yes, I can address that. The United Nations says that there's hundreds of millions of people who still do not have access to basic drinking water services, which means getting water in from a pipe or a well and taking less than 30 minutes to bring it home. Can you imagine even having to go and get the water? Because I can't.
And you have to carry it back.
Right, and these people also are lacking, there's over 1 billion people lacking sanitation services, which are anywhere from a latrine or septic system to wastewater treatment plants.
It's pretty shocking stuff.
It really is.
It's very
sad.
shocking. And I know that they are talking about the fact that one day water will be traded on the stock exchange. And that's kind of a scary thought when you think about that it will become such a valuable commodity. And countries will deal with each other, in their trade, concessions with water.
Well, Israel has created, they have a very strong water policy being in the Middle East, and they have developed some interesting technologies. They invented drip irrigation, for example, and their water policies have opened the doors to diplomacy. For example, China has broke the Arab embargo on Israel and opened diplomatic ties with them to learn more about the technologies that Israel uses with regard to water.
Fascinating. Well, they always said Israel made the desert bloom.
Yes.
Which is pretty remarkable stuff. Well, I think what we need to do is, since water has become such an issue, I really think one of the most important things we can do on this program is share with people ways that each individual can be helpful in saving water. I have a cousin who's such a fanatic about water. I think I told you about her. She, heaven forbid you let the shower run too long or you let the water run too much while you're brushing your teeth. I mean, she's like really all over it. So I think we should really talk a bit about what can the individual do.
Well, yeah, the individual can do a lot, but let's address just how big this issue is in water scarcity. And the United Nations feels that in just 10 years, the world is going to have only 60% of the water that it needs. And that's due to population growth and increased food production, as well as increased consumer use and climate change and precipitation pattern change. And so this is the capacity, actually. Water can become so scarce that it can actually create political unrest, never mind being traded on the stock market. But as millions of people lose access to fresh water, they're going to be forced to migrate. And this can create millions of refugees as well as some potential political unrest. So it really behooves us to save that water and protect what we have.
Well, I think you told me once that the amount of water on Earth is so huge. And yet,
Yes.
And I always wonder why there are not more desalination plants.
Well, they're extremely expensive and the technology is new. So despite the fact the world is covered, 70% of the surface of this planet is covered in water, but only less than 1/100% of all that water is on the surface and drinkable.
Wow.
So that is why it behooves us to really protect. This is a precious resource, and
absolutely.
that all humans need.
Absolutely.
So
it's absolutely essential. Well, let's discuss what the individual can do, because I think the majority of people don't stop to think about water. Most of us are very blessed. We need water, we turn on the spigot and there it is.
yeah,
So that's it, unless you get a notice from your water company saying there's too much lead in your water.
that's bad.
And that's scary.
Well, the first thing that people can do is to stop littering, because it turns out that most of the garbage that we throw on the ground, whether it's originally in the water or not,
Ends
often
up
gets
there.
washed into the rivers and waterways by rainstorms and eventually makes its way to the ocean. And conservation groups say that if we continue to dump the amount of garbage we do into the oceans now, that by 2050 there'll actually be more plastic in the ocean than fish. So it really behooves us to not throw our garbage in the oceans.
Right.
The good news is that there are groups like the Hackensack River Keeper and the Hudson River Keeper and other advocacy groups that are actually
Cleaning
trying
up.
to educate and clean up. And I just learned that the end of this month, there's going to be one day that there are going to be 60 different sites in New Jersey alone that are going to have volunteer cleanups.
Wonderful.
So that's an example of us
what?
moving forward.
Absolutely.
And there are also entrepreneurs that are developing machines to try to pick up some of this garbage, both on the shores and in waterways and in the ocean.
Well, that's important. Well, there was this one guy who had developed this netting system, but I was told that it didn't pan out.
The big thing in the ocean,
Yeah.
the prototype is not working so well. So
That's
there's still
too
a
bad.
lot of work to do on that.
Oh my goodness. Well, I had read that 10 of the world's major rivers pollute 90% of the ocean dumping. And so the rivers have to be cleaned, before it can get to the ocean.
Right.
Now, when you say they're entrepreneurs who are trying to develop ways of cleaning it up, these are pretty small units, right?
Yes, they're all pretty much individuals and startup companies.
Mhm.
There is no major governmental policy or organization right now
Mhm.
that actually does any cleanups.
Wow.
So,
We could really use that.
yes, it's an area for good thing. There's another thing, though, that we need to work on to keep our waterways clean, and that's to keep the chemicals out of the water. And
That's the big, big thing.
there are several types of chemicals. First, I want to address medications. We have, in America, there are millions and millions of people on hormone drugs as well as antidepressants, and some of these drugs actually pass through our bodies and go into the wastewater and the sewer, and our wastewater facilities here in this country do not remove any chemicals from the water. So it really behooves us to not throw anything down the drain that doesn't belong. And that includes grease and oil, and any medications should be thrown in landfills. But then there's another source of chemicals. There's industrial chemicals, and those have, thanks to the EPA and the Clean Water Act, industries are not supposed to dump any chemicals in the water, and that's a good thing. But we are also finding now agricultural chemicals, both pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers there's an increased use in all of those chemicals, and we're finding them more and more in the waterways.
And they're causing the algae blooms,
And
which basically kill fish.
right, well, it goes in an order, and the fertilizers create extra nutrients in the water, and then the warmer waters, partly because of global warming, are the perfect home for algae to have blooms, and we're seeing more and more of them, and of course they're dangerous both to us and our pets. And then the algae blooms, as the algae dies, bacteria eats it, and that's an aerobic process, and so it sucks up all the oxygen in the water. And so once there's no oxygen in the water,
The fish die.
all aquatic life dies.
dies, yeah.
And so that's what we call a dead zone, and there are dead zones now around the world, and unfortunately they're growing more and more. So it really behooves us to not dump fertilizers in particular into the waterways.
Right.
And that's when we talk about what an individual can do. One of the things individuals can do, besides watching what they throw down the drain, is watching what they put on their lawns, and to choose to plant more drought-resistant indigenous landscapes that don't require so many
Fertilize.
chemicals or so much water in the
Right.
dry seasons.
Right.
So that's another thing they can do.
That's very important. But I think most people, unfortunately, if they've already got a lawn already planted, they'd be reluctant to dig everything up and start all over again. In other words, I think the people who already established would find it difficult.
Well,
But
what
they could certainly request to only use those products which would be healthy, for the soil.
yes, and one thing, many homeowners don't use the right amounts, so they over fertilize their lawn, and so what isn't absorbed by the grass is what's run off and into our waterways.
Absolutely.
But they can start by planting a rain garden, or just taking one section of your yard and actually build a butterfly garden, because both the bees and the butterflies are losing their habitats at incredible rates, and we need them to pollinate and become part of the food chain. So actually, you can start small with a small section, and eventually, hopefully, we can convince enough people that a green lawn isn't really necessary.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the bees and the butterflies. I don't know if you remember this, but several years ago there was a huge killing of butterflies in, I think it was Mexico, because the climate there there was a terrible cold snap, and they go there to stay warm. Do you remember that? And
Yeah, well,
it killed off so many
actually,
millions.
the monarch butterflies, the California monarch butterfly population, which also goes down to Mexico to winter, that's down 99% in the last 20 years. And the eastern monarch butterfly, which comes by us and east of the Rockies, they're down by 80 to 90% over the last 2 decades due to habitat loss as well as herbicides and some climate change. So it really is sad, and there are environmental groups like the Environmental Defense Fund that are making specific efforts to try to recreate butterfly habitat. And you can see it among some of our highways. We've now, instead of having just grass between the two sides of traffic, we are now in some areas we actually have wildflowers, which is very pretty, actually, in addition to helping the wildlife.
Well, I'm very fortunate because some years ago, as a gift, one of my son-in-laws planted a butterfly bush for me. And I want to tell you something, butterfly bushes grow like wild. It went from being a little bush to now, I mean, it's taking up a huge amount of my backyard. But unfortunately, I used to see many more butterflies than I do now. I'm so excited when if you come, the big monarchs are so beautiful.
Yes, well, we're losing a lot of good insects, and there are some scientists who believe that by the end of the century we might lose up to 1 million species. I just happened to have read it today.
I know, that's pretty.
So very sad.
That's pretty unnerving. What can I say? Now, the sanitation problem, that has to require some intervention, beyond what is being done. And how is that being addressed?
Well,
each country is obviously doing has a whole different methodology.
Well, some countries don't even have the infrastructure to deal with it and to do anything, which is extremely sad. And other countries like the United States and much of Europe, they have in place wastewater treatment facilities, but the methodologies they use, again, only remove the bacteria and germs and the solid human waste. And so they do not remove any chemicals, and so we thus have a whole group called chemicals of emerging concern, and that includes the medications as well as flame retardants and insecticides and caffeine, and it's actually having an effect. They have found fish in the Potomac River as well as both Carolinas, small and largemouth bass, and they found male bass growing eggs in their testes. So they call those intersex fish.
Wow. So
our wastewater really is having a ramification, and this requires new technologies and new science. And unfortunately, when you talk about an industrialized society like us, it's going to take a lot of money to make these changes.
Yes.
So.
Well, it's interesting because I read recently that both France and England have doubled their pledge of funding for this type of work, which is very hopeful.
Yes.
So we got to get back to the good news, girl, because there's enough dire stuff out there. One bit of good news is that young people are really stepping up to the plate. This young woman,
Greta Thunberg.
Greta Thunberg, showed that here is a very young person who can make a major difference. And there have been millions and millions and millions of people joining and protesting for cleaning up the environment, for better environmental policies. And it's interesting to note that many of our major changes, many of them have been led by the youth. And so I think that's a very hopeful note.
Yes, the youth and grassroots policies. Here in New Jersey, grassroots policies got the private company to not build a new natural gas power plant.
That's
So
great.
that was all due to get grassroots.
Well, that's another thing
attempts.
I wanted to say in terms of how the individual can help. One of the most important things they can do is vote.
Yes.
And most people hear the word vote and they think of the presidential election, but it's voting for your local congressman, for your town people, for your freeholders. That is such a vital thing, and we have to vote in people who want to protect the planet, because
Yes.
we've seen what destruction can be caused when the wrong people are in office.
Right.
So that is very hopeful.
Yes, we need to help people to have the correct policies
Absolutely.
put in place.
Absolutely. Well, Susan, you've been a wonderful guest again.
Thank
I'm
you.
so grateful, and I want to thank you so much. You helped define so many of the things. And hopefully, we will have people in office who will be sure that the future generation can live sustainably on the planet. And I'd just like to say to our viewers that if you'd like to learn more about Susan and her work, you can go to her website, which is sgoldeneducation.com.
That's right.
I know that you do speaking and you do other things, and so I'm going to make that suggestion. And I really want to thank all of my viewers again for being with us today, and hopefully you will find some of this information useful and helpful. And I look forward to seeing you at our next Lighten Up with Isabel.
Until next time, remember to live a more joyous life. Lighten up.